Yeah, open-minded with opportunities, etc. Because not every human rebirth, of course, is precious. All right. Yes, boss, you want to add? No, go ahead. Okay. All right. So it's like a city of Gandharvas. Do you know anything more of the city of Gandharvas? The kind of okay. So like a mirage, like an optical illusion, or like a yes. Who's this one?
No.
Okay. All right. So that's saying, therefore, the focal objects of afflictions, the causes. So pleasure, so pleasant feelings, etc., they don't exist inherently. Neither do the focal objects, which also give rise to the three poisons, they don't exist inherently. And the fact that they still appear, well, they appear to us, they're like an optical illusion. They seem to be out there, objectively, but they don't exist that way. Then number 9 is actually, starting with number 9, it's refuting not the inherent existence of the causes of attachment and aversion. So taking attachment and aversion separately from confusion. How could the pleasant and unpleasant arise in ones who are like an illusory person and like a reflection? So actually pleasure and displeasure are like an illusory person. This is weird that you use an object. That is what you want to explain, that appears one way, exists in a different way, and you take an illusory person to demonstrate that. Usually it's the other way around. The person is exemplified by something else. Here you take an illusory person, a person who appears one way and exists in a different way. Which one is it? 9. Yeah. So, Yumikyo, yeah, it means Yumikyo, like an illusory person, as in like maybe a magical apparition. When you have a magician making a person appear, making an elephant or a horse appear. Okay, so that would still be, well, in English you probably wouldn't say it's a person, but the word person in Tibetan, and I guess in Sanskrit too, includes also other living beings. So basically a living being, an illusory living being. So pleasure and pleasant and unpleasant feelings arise in ones who are like, in those who are like an illusory, in ones who are like an illusory person, and like of reflections. How could the pleasant and unpleasant arise in ones who are like an illusory person and like a reflection? So you could, in ones. So I guess how could they arise in a person? So it would actually refer to a person or a living being who's like an illusion, who doesn't exist inherently, who just appears to exist inherently. How can they appear as such in those who are like a reflection or like an illusion? How can it arise in our continuum? Okay. The pleasant and unpleasant, how can they arise in that way? And then number 10. Okay, so saying pleasant and unpleasant. So the pleasant and unpleasant describing why they do not exist inherently. We've already heard previously they don't exist inherently. I gave you the reason. It seems as if it's innate in the object, etc. That is one reason. But another reason is also that they're relative. Pleasant is dependent on the unpleasant. Unpleasant is dependent on the pleasant. So it's relative. The two are relative. So, for instance, if we see something as beautiful, okay, seeing an object as beautiful or pleasant, it is in relation to something else that we see it as pleasant. I think a good example would be, for instance, when you've been really, really sick, and the first day you feel better, and every experience, just normal food that ordinarily would not give you pleasure, gives you great pleasure in that moment. So it's in relation to something worse. That also accounts for the fact when you're really, really hungry, the first moment of food is really pleasant because of the stoppage of the suffering of hunger in that moment. It's in relation to that the happiness is much greater. If you were really hungry, if you were really thirsty, the first moment of water is much more blissful. Why? Because it is in relation to something worse that we experience this as pleasure. Right? Does that make sense? It's like, that's why they say that nirvanic pleasure is so much greater, that you would actually experience our ordinary pleasure as suffering, because in comparison to nirvanic pleasure, this is actually suffering. A person who's reached nirvana, they would say, ugh, this is what you call pleasure? It's ridiculous. Okay? But for us, it's the greatest we can achieve. And so because we want happiness, that's what we search. So not everything is explained in relation to the Buddha's qualities, for instance. But I guess you could say afflictions are afflictions, again, in relation to a mind that is free from them. Happiness is also described, or suffering. The reason we say all our experiences are in the nature of suffering is because in relation to the happiness someone experiences whose mind is free from the obscuration is so much greater. So it's in the nature of suffering. But leaving aside that type of happiness, what we call happiness and what we call suffering, again they are dependent on each other. Pleasure, what we call pleasure, is dependent on something we would call suffering. But of course also pain is similar, but pain is very interesting. Just take eating something hot, okay? I really like hot food. And I drink this crazy drink. It's got so much ginger in it that it seems like to burn your mouth. And I love it. So I always drink it in Germany. And my sister one day, she always saw me drinking on it. And one day she was like, oh, the way you drink it is so delicious. But she didn't ask me, she just drank from it. And she was like, bah! She started spitting. So what was, for me, pleasure was suffering for her. You see, it's again, in relation to certain foods, for me it was pleasure. So there's nothing inherent in it. It's in relation to something worse. It can be pleasure in relation to a certain experience. It's pleasure for me in relation to the same experience, I don't know same, but probably similar, to my sister, it's suffering. But every time I come back from Germany, after 3 months in Germany, and then I eat my first breakfast in Delhi, I go, what did I put in the eggs? And they're like, nothing, Madam G. It's just normal eggs. Because they always had chili. You put it everywhere. And then I say, non-spicy, but it's not spicy, it's normal. So I don't want to know what spicy feels like. But I'm no longer used to. So my taste buds are no longer. So you see, it's dependent on all these causes and conditions that I experience it as pain or pleasure. The same an Indian person eating the same breakfast would go, wow. Again, there's nothing inherent in the food that makes it hot, pleasant, or unpleasant. You see? And it's a relation to a worse kind. Okay, so with it being hot or not hot, they wouldn't even recognize. I wouldn't even know it's hot food. When I leave India, I don't know whether it's hot food or not. I wouldn't even know whether something is hot food or not. Okay? So it's in relation to something hotter that I would say it's not hot food. While someone in Germany, in relation to something that has no chili, they would say it's hot. So the same is true with pleasant and unpleasant, hot and cold, long and short. Okay? So pleasant feelings just in relation to something weaker or something other than that, it becomes pleasant. Pleasant or something less pleasant than that. So pleasant depends on unpleasant, and unpleasant depends on pleasant. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Shara, no? Clarification?
The two different explanations about the dependence of pleasant and unpleasant. One is that it is not in the object.
Yes.
But
yes.
the other one is that it is not only but the pleasant is not in the, let's say, in the food, but the pleasant depends on unpleasant experience.
Yes.
That means the experience
yes.
depends on another experience.
Yes.
Not just
yes.
that we're looking at another.
Both. It's dependent on so many things.
Yeah, but I mean, it is possible to analyze it. Now I'm looking at it in this
yes.
way, I'm looking at it in that way.
Yes.
I want to understand it from
yes,
different
that's
angles.
what I just said. Previously I said that such and such. Like in verse 6, I mentioned it, because it's not really mentioned here. But here it mentions the relativity, like pleasant versus unpleasant, hot, cold, long, short. Yeah, in those cases, yes, absolutely.
Is it true that you can't? I don't know.
Yeah.
Can you not have a pleasant experience? Many things are relative.
No, just saying it's pleasure, independence on something. It doesn't mean you have to have, like a Buddha has no unpleasant experiences. So for the Buddha to have a pleasant experience, it doesn't require, but we still, we call it pleasure in relation to something worse. I mean, pleasure, displeasure, like long and short. Okay? Like think of it like long and short. Even if you have the longest thing there is, it would still be...
Long and short is very clear. Beautiful and ugly and many things.
Yeah.
Pleasant. Okay.
Well, let's think about it. Pleasant and unpleasant. Especially worldly pleasure and displeasure. Definitely worldly ones. Our worldly pleasure and displeasure. They're definitely relative. So the other part is to be analyzed, yeah. Okay, great. Now here it says the unpleasant, now here's a little bit confusing. The unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed, cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore the pleasant is not tenable. I want to check your intelligence. The unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed, cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore the pleasant is not tenable.
Tenable is like saying valid?
It's not, it's not tenable or reasonable or acceptable. As like inherently existent. I thought it was just not. So why does it say that? The unpleasant depending on which the pleasant is imputed cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. So the unpleasant depends on the pleasant. Therefore the pleasant does not exist inherently. Why does it say that?
Number 10 or 11? Which one?
10.
11.
No, 10. The unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed, cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore, the pleasant does not exist inherently. What is that? He does it on purpose. He does that on purpose. It's not... Actually, we would think it should be the other way around. Cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore, the unpleasant is not tenable, since it depends on the pleasant. But here it's saying, because the unpleasant depends on the pleasant, therefore the pleasant does not exist inherently. What does that mean?
Isn't it also vice versa?
Yes, that's in the 11.
So it means
Then in
both
11.
are relative. So
No, but there's a particular reason for why he puts it this way. What could that be?
If the unpleasant wasn't there, then the pleasant wasn't there.
That is true, but how can you make the connection here?
He doesn't.
He's kind of taking a loop, a slight loop.
Yes.
The present is short. The present is it's short time.
The pleasant is short time. Okay. The pleasant is a short time, okay? But then the unpleasant...
It's a way, a long way.
Okay, but why do you say when the unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed, cannot exist without? So because, he's saying, because the unpleasant depends on the pleasant, therefore the pleasant doesn't exist inherently.
It's like saying because this is the result, because it is the result of that cause is not existing inherently, because this cause brings result.
But it's that which the pleasant is dependent on the unpleasant. No, sorry, the unpleasant is dependent on the pleasant.
Yes.
Because it is dependent, therefore, it should actually be the unpleasant because it depends on the pleasant.
Yeah.
Therefore, the unpleasant doesn't exist inherently. But he says the pleasant. Why does he say that?
It's made a mistake because because the sprout is the result of the seed. The seed is non-inherently existent because otherwise it won't bring a result. And this is if we want to say that something is as a cause.
No, I think there's another reason.
Compare the next verse.
The next verse is the same. The pleasant, depending on which the unpleasant is imputed, cannot exist without depending on the unpleasant. Thus, the unpleasant is not tenable. So it's the same thing, but the other way around.
If one is the opposite of the other, then the other does not exist if the first is not there, is not imputed. Is not, you can't have an opposite of something which does not exist.
Okay. So?
So that's what he's saying.
Okay. I believe what he means is the pleasant does not exist inherently because it depends on the unpleasant, which also doesn't exist inherently because it depends on the pleasant.
That's what we said.
That's what Shara said?
We all think.
That's what we all meant. You said
Is
no,
that
no, it's not
zero?
Not in those words.
not in those words, but that's what you meant.
Okay, but that's always the difficulty, like in the debate, for instance, you know, you mean something, but you don't say it. And then the other person kind of says, well, you're wrong because it's this one. So you say, but I said it, but not exactly. I mean, I may have just not heard it, of course, sorry if I didn't, so you seem to. But I mean, like, I thought Shaka said because it depends on the cause, and it also gives rise to a result, so therefore it cannot. You're talking about cause and effect here. Here we're not talking about cause and effect. We're talking about the
Interconnected.
the pleasant is dependent on the unpleasant. The unpleasant is dependent on the pleasant. So, because the unpleasant doesn't exist inherently, because it depends on the pleasant, therefore the pleasant doesn't exist inherently because it depends on something that doesn't exist inherently. Why? Because it depends on the pleasant.
It's I know the chinos, that I know the chinos, that I know the chinos. There's a song like this.
Wow. You could make a whole song out of this. Alright, so the unpleasant depending on which the pleasant is imputed cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore, the pleasant, being dependent on the unpleasant, which doesn't exist inherently, doesn't exist inherently either.
It's a kind of a crooked way, no?
It's crooked, right? It's like a loop.
Yeah.
It wouldn't hold, no? I mean, it doesn't really.
It's like a circular argument. You could say it's a circular argument.
Yeah.
Why does it depend? But I mean, it does hold. It is true there. It's. I mean, you could also put it differently. You could just say the pleasant doesn't exist inherently because to be pleasant. I mean, I think pleasant and unpleasant we have a bit of a hard time with because we have kind of a sense there's something within the feeling. And the feeling is much harder. But just this object. Okay, it's much easier to understand. There's no long or short in this. There's nothing that can be found that is long and short. Why? Because this is short only in relation to something large. This is short in relation to a broomstick and long in relation to a matchstick. Okay? So it's both long and both short. Okay? If it existed inherently as long, what would be the problem? If that was inherently long, or it was inherently short, what would be the problem?
No, other things could be.
Pardon?
Nothing could be shorter than this
Yeah.
if it was inherently short.
No, in particular, it would neither be long nor short. Or both. Actually, long and short would be contradictory. Sorry. Long and short would be contradictory. Long and short would be contradictory. Why?
It's short.
Oh, because they are.
Because we can find something
It's
that's
only
short,
short,
but
it's
is
short.
not dependent
It
on.
doesn't have the
But is not dependent inherently.
Look, long and short would be contradictory. Irid, why? You said something.
Because long and short describes a relativity.
Yes?
And if it is one thing, it cannot be relative to anything else. So that
Okay, can you give me an example why? Okay, I'll tell you why. In relation to a matchstick, this cannot be both long and short. In relation to the same thing, this cannot be both long and short. When we think long and short are contradictory, actually mean in relation to the same thing, it cannot be long and short. Okay? So in relation to the same feeling, something cannot be pleasant and unpleasant at the same time. Now, if it existed inherently as long and short, then it wouldn't be in relation to this long and in relation to that short. It would be like saying, in relation to a matchstick, it's long, and in relation to a matchstick, it's also short. You would, in relation to which there wouldn't be anything, so it couldn't be long or short either.
It's like taking
Neither.
it out of the phenomena world and being totally separate from all other stuff.
Yeah, it would be like, I'm trying to bring forth this logic here. In relation to A, this cannot be long and short. Would you all agree? Right. In relation to A, it can be long. In relation to B, it can be short. But if you leave out A and B, and you still say it's long and short, then it cannot be neither. Because it would be like saying, in relation to A, it's both long and short. Or in relation to nothing, it's both long and short. That wouldn't work.
It doesn't have to be the same thing. You can have two sticks. one is long and one is short. Not with the
That's a totally different argument. We're not going into a different argument. We're taking the same stick. Anyway, sorry.
Would you say also
One clarification, please.
Man and woman, are they relative?
Yes.
But are they dependent on each other? Is a man in dependence on a woman, and is a woman dependent? No.
Why not?
Well, if there were no women, there would be no men.
There would be no, if there was no man, there would be no woman.
There would be no man and no, if there was no woman, there would be no man and no woman.
Okay, you can discuss this in your discussion plan.
Geshe, one clarification.
Yes.
What is the meaning, depending on which the pleasant is imputed? Why is imputed?
Okay, the unpleasant depending on which the pleasant is imputed. Okay, here there was one question. The unpleasant dependent on which the pleasant is imputed. What does that mean? The unpleasant in dependence on which the pleasant is imputed. What does that mean? The long stick,
the soup?
which is imputed long, which is called. Oh yeah, Irit?
It can only be unpleasant if we can prove that it's not pleasant. Yeah? I think this is what it means.
Wait. Let me say this. The long, depending on which the short is imputed. The long, the broomstick, in comparison to which we call this. So we call something pleasant
In comparison to unpleasant.
in dependence on or in comparison to. So you have to compare it to something, so it depends on something else. Depending on that, we call it long or short. So the imputed is important. It is imputed, we call it long, in dependence on something shorter. In comparison, you could say in comparison or in dependence on.
There is two objects here. One is unpleasant to speak, and the other is pleasant. Which
Yes.
of them is the imputed one?
Both are imputed.
Both here, but when you say independent on which the pleasant is imputed, so this imputed.
Oh, in this case, the unpleasant is called unpleasant in comparison to pleasant.
Which verse?
No. The unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed. Verse 10. The unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed.
The pleasant is imputed depending on the unpleasant.
No. The unpleasant, depending on which... Yes, you're right. The pleasant is imputed in dependence on the unpleasant. That's right. So
Therefore, the pleasant is not tenable. It's very simple.
Yes, it's very simple.
Yes, but it says the unpleasant cannot exist without depending. You see the next part.
The pleasant depends on the unpleasant to be imputed.
That is true. That's
But
not...
the unpleasant itself depends on the pleasant.
Yes.
Because the pleasant in the first is not...
No, but that's not the point here. It's saying here, it cannot exist, the unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed, cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore, the pleasant is not tenable. Right? So this is why it cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Here the focus is on the unpleasant. Because the unpleasant is the main object, depending on which the pleasant is imputed. Okay? The unpleasant, so it's like the unpleasant, so in dependence on the unpleasant, the pleasant is imputed. So it's showing that the pleasant is dependent on the unpleasant. And so that unpleasant, on the basis of which the pleasant is imputed, cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. Therefore, so you make this loop, you have both here. Of course, in the first sentence...
The discussion here is on the pleasant.
The meaning of the thing is that we project pleasant and unpleasant in comparison to one another.
Okay.
There's no inherent...
I tell you something. Okay. Usually this is debated. You debate this. You say like the unpleasant. You take the unpleasant, depending on which the pleasant is imputed. It cannot exist without depending on the pleasant. So you're describing here that the pleasant depends on the unpleasant, but also the unpleasant depends on the pleasant. So since you're saying both, and since the unpleasant cannot exist without depending on the pleasant, therefore the pleasant is not tenable. But the way it makes it sound, when you read it both ways, of course when you mention the first part, it also mentions that it's imputed in dependence on that. But it mentions both. It's mentioning both. Not only is the pleasant imputed basis on the unpleasant, but also because the pleasant depends on the unpleasant, which doesn't exist inherently because it depends on the pleasant, therefore the pleasant is not tenable. It includes both. It includes both. It's saying both. It's saying that the unpleasant depends on the pleasant depends on the unpleasant. So saying both, therefore directly it tells you, can we just switch this off?
No, it's a Dharma phone. It can be an emergency. That's why.
What kind of Dharma? It's like a Dharma hospital, I get it.
It's the pleasant or the unpleasant.
This is the Dharma emergency. What there is in hospital? Watch yourself.
Not feeling unpleasant.
It was unpleasant.
Attachment.
Why do we need 11?
Well, because the emphasis is on that which is imputed. The pleasant is imputed based on the unpleasant. And the unpleasant, on which the pleasant is imputed, it doesn't exist inherently. It doesn't exist in and of itself because it depends again on the pleasant. So therefore the pleasant is not tenable. But it goes both ways.
Yeah, so we can say that 10 is for both things.
No, but Vada, what did I say before?
Meditation.
This is like, meditation. It's a meditation manual. Of course, a lot of this here is self-explanatory. You're right. If you read one, you know the other. But it's like you sit down and you focus on that, right? You focus on that. And then you switch it around. You had the same in verse 5, line 1 and 2, and line 3 and 4. You had again that reversal. Okay? Anyway, now, right, after all this discussion...
I heard once that Geshe said that when we walk around in the world, we should think, I'm wrong. That's what the Nagarjuna says, we are wrong, we are wrong.
Yes, it's true. Yes, it's true. Like, well, his holiness says, not that much, like, he doesn't say wrong, but he says it's like an illusion, it's just like an illusion. It appears that way, it doesn't exist that way. It appears that, that's definitely, if we don't understand in that moment, but really to go through this, to take to mind these two with regard to the pleasant and the unpleasant. Okay? Though it sounds like a circular argument.
And maybe he does it because he really wants to clean the attachment, really wants that, because...
No, what he wants us to do is this. He wants us, when we think of emptiness, we're stuck. We think, I, the emptiness of the I. We never think of the emptiness of an action. The emptiness of the pleasant. Take any experience here. Here you have perception of senses, then you have feelings, then you have afflictions. So look at each one of them, the pleasant and the unpleasant. They depend on each other. One is labeled in dependence on the other is dependent on the basis of one. The pleasant is not found in the object. The pleasant is the result of perceiving sense objects. The sense objects cannot be found. They don't exist inherently. They depend on many, many factors. They depend on karma. You see, there's like this intricate net of things being interwoven. And one we call anger, and one we call pleasure, and it seems to be clearly there, but it isn't. It's like Irit said, when you start looking for it, it's only atoms.
Yeah.
Right? It's just moments of awareness.
Is the self dependent on the non-self?
Is the self dependent on the non-self? Yes.
So I should experience non-self to experience.
Okay, never mind now. All right.
Moments of awareness.
Okay, great. Sorry, if I had more time. Sorry. Pardon?
On verse 9, it's what you said now.
אנחנו כבר במצב כפית.
Verse 9.
Okay. Anyway, so having said this, 12, if there's no pleasant, how can there be desire? If there is no unpleasant, how can there be aversion? So you can see like how you go through the meditation. Pleasant dependent on unpleasant, unpleasant dependent on pleasant, imputed on the basis of that, dependent on the other, right? Cause is a cause and dependence on an effect is an effect and dependence on the cause, the reciprocal kind of relationship. So then there's nothing intrinsic there, nothing inherently there, because it depends on so many other factors to be called pleasant. So if there's no pleasant, what are we attached to?
Yeah, that's...
If there's no real pleasure, right? No real pleasure, what are we so attached to?
Yeah.
If there's no real unpleasant experience, what are we so attached to? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Just to see it as a meditation. So, sorry for rushing you so much, but... Okay, then the next is the refutation of error. Okay? All right. So this is yes, please. Sure. Go ahead.